Buenas tardes a todos. Una
Good
vez
afternoon to all. Once again, we welcome you to the IACO Conference on Immigrant Integration in 2021. Next, we're going to start our first panel, The Legacy of Immigrants in the United States. June is designated as Immigrant Heritage Month. The nation recognizes and celebrates the achievements and contributions that immigrants and their children have made to shape history, strengthen the economy, and enrich the culture of the United States. Throughout history, from the first settlers to the present, immigrants from all over the world have arrived in the United States, making it the most multiracial and multicultural country in the world. A report by the Pew Research Center offers a historical look at the impact of immigration on the demographics of the nation. The first significant influx of immigrants came from Europe. By 1850, the Irish were the largest group of immigrants nationwide. In the 1880s, Germans were the majority in the Midwestern and Southeastern states, and Chinese immigrants in California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Nevada. At the beginning of the 20th century, a new wave of immigration from Europe was launched. In the 1930s, Italians were the nation's largest immigrant group. The composition of immigrants changed again in the post 1965 immigration era. The era of great diversification began with a significant increase in immigrants from all over Latin America, the Caribbean islands, and Asia. Since the 1980s, Mexicans became the largest group of immigrants in the country, followed by those from India, China, El Salvador, Dominican Republic, Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, Cuba, Guatemala, and Colombia, among others. The change in the demographics of the United States is indisputable and inevitable. According to the Pew study and projections, immigrants and their descendants accounted for 72 million in US population growth between 1965 and 2015, and it's expected to represent further 103 million by 2065. Next, prominent researchers and historians will delve into this important topic. The panel will be moderated by journalist Luis Alejandro Medina, who specializes in immigration issues and is a reporter for Telemundo 47.
Cordial saludo, les habla Luis Alejandro Medina, periodista de Noticiero
I
47.
would like to greet you all. I'm Luis Alejandro Medina from Noticiero 47, Telemundo, and the moderation of an important subject and in times in which the United States lives a time in which this is a parameter that helps to analyze and look at the present and future and what's coming in a key subject, fundamental this time due to political change, a change of administration, and this new change that generates some hope, but also many questions by immigrants of this nation. And for me, it's a great honor to take part in this IACO event. It's an event that happens at historical times for our nation, and we should be proud of the contributions of immigrants to this nation, the legacy, the contributions of immigrants to the United States. And here we're talking about immigration since the first pilgrims to Massachusetts and found indigenous population. So there, the immigration process started, and because this country has always welcomed immigrants for the first pilgrims, and when happened when so many arrived from Europe and this process. And in order to analyze, here we have two experts, two professors that are well acquainted to this subject, legacy of immigrants, and what they represent as a force for our nation. First, Francis Arigote Freire. He's a historian, a professor of the King University, and he's written two books. One about Cuba and Fulgencio Batista, and the other one it's about history of the Caribbean. and all this wetness and richness that we have from the Caribbean. He's well acquainted with this subject from an academic perspective, and he knows a lot about the contributions and on this immigration subject. And we also have the pleasure to having Mark Hugo Lopez. He is the director of immigration, director of resident institute research at of one of the best known institutes for the Hispanic community. I'm referring to the Pew Research Institute, and that's a framework and a reference when we talk about immigration and what immigrants are thinking, what Americans think before immigration reform, and what do we have, and the economic impact to the United States and the benefits of reform that represents a lot for our people, and all that is interesting. And since everything has a beginning and an end, I would like to invite Professor Gotti so that he can share with us about in his wonderful presentation on what this legacy means and how we've been able to edify a nation based on the contributions of immigrants and the perspective in this crucial times we're living in the United States. Be welcome. Thank you, Luis, for your kind introduction.
In English today.
Mm.
I want to thank the sponsors for inviting me. They have set before me the modest task of presenting a history of immigration in about 20 minutes. And so even for a college professor, it's going to be a bit much, but let's see how we do. I think it's important for all of us, and I know I'm addressing people from the Latino communities of the United States. So I think it's so important for us to arm ourselves with historical knowledge as we confront the forces of ignorance that reside in our nation. Some of the ignorance is innocent. It comes from people that do not know any better. They wish to be informed. And then there are others that seek to divide us, to turn us against each other. There are people out there acting in bad faith. Our Latino communities, for some, are political footballs to be used to score political points. They wish to scapegoat our communities. They want to blame us for everything that is wrong with the nation. They want to diminish our contributions. And don't let them do it. Gently challenge those with stereotypes who just don't know any better, and assertively engage those that seek to make us the subject of division. So I wanted to provide that historical background for you to give you some ammunition in this battle of ideas. So in thinking about today's talk, I thought I would try and focus on three basic themes. Number one, a brief overview of immigration in the United States since its founding in 1776. It is an issue that has been with us since the founding of the nation, and as Luis noted, even before that. So to put things in context, I did a quick review recently, and Mark Hugo can share, shed further light on this. And I saw that the number of foreign-born in the United States was about 14%, or about 47 million or so. In terms of percentages, this is somewhat lower than was the case in the early part of the 20th century, when the percentage of foreign-born approached 20%. So that's sort of theme number one, this broad overview. Number two, I want to talk about the contributions of Latinos and Latin Americans to our nation. There's a real big misconception among some that the presence of folks from Latin America in the United States is a recent phenomena. Some folks don't realize that a large part of the United States was previously part of Mexico or part of the Spanish Empire. And my focus, however, will be on recent immigrants from Latin America. But it's important to keep that historical knowledge, in the background. And finally, number three, the third point I'd like to make is a warning, really, against tendencies in our own communities to think of one immigrant group as better than another. So let me dive right in here. I want to start with some excerpts from Benjamin Franklin. So in 1789, so the story goes, he's walking towards Constitution Hall in Philadelphia, and he's upset when he hears people speaking German on the streets of Philadelphia. And he's worried that German immigrants would undermine the nation and that they would not adapt to the culture as defined by the earlier English settlers. So I looked through my history text. I just want to read you a couple of quick excerpts from Benjamin Franklin, excuse me, as he's describing German immigrants. So he says in general about immigrants, those who come hither are generally of the most ignorant, stupid sort of their own nation. And then he goes on to say, not being used to liberty, they know not how to make a modest use of it. Few of their children in the country learn English. All right, so he's already bringing up that concern about language, which so predominates the debate. They import many books from Germany, and of the 6 printing houses in Pennsylvania, 2 are entirely German, 2 half German, half English, and but 2 entirely English. And then finally, just to conclude him, they will soon outnumber us, and all of the advantages we have will not, in my opinion, to be able to preserve our language, and even our government will become precarious. You could take his language, his verbiage, and bring it right into our modern context today, and you see how it applies. I always tell my student, as Luis mentioned, I'm a college professor, but the United States is a nation of immigration and immigrants, but it's also a nation of immigrant bashing. Every immigrant group has come under similar withering criticism. So now I want to take a moment here. Let's hope my technology doesn't fail me. And I want to share a few caricatures with you from the late 19th and early 20th century. So just bear with me a second here. Okay, so I think we have it. So these, as I mentioned, these caricatures I have are from the late 19th and earliest 20th centuries. And they illustrate this point I was making with the quotes by Benjamin Franklin. And most of these images I'm going to show you come from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which has a very nice collection. So here in this image, we see this issue come up about immigrants sending their money away to a foreign country. This is so often used against immigrant communities today. And here in this caricature from 1882, it is used against Irish immigrants. Right over here on the left side of the panel, you see a leprechaunish sort of person working in construction, right? And over here on the top left, you have a washerwoman, right? So I know the print is probably a little too small, but over here the caption says, American Gold, United States working for it. So these Irish folks are working for their money. And over here, you have Ireland waiting for it. So when you see in this image on the right-hand side, you have these 2 Irish folks and their family waiting on the shores for this boat from America so they can receive money from their family members, all right? So, and the caricaturist doesn't mean this in a positive way. And so often we hear that criticism today. This next image couldn't be any more insulting to the immigrants of the early 20th century, mostly from Eastern Europe, Italy, and so forth. Over there in the background, you see these sort of European aristocrats And they couldn't be happier, right? They are cheering on the Pied Piper, who's dressed as Uncle Sam. And you see that he is leading away the rats from Europe, right? And so this conjures up this notion of disease carriers, as rats do, right? And some of these rats, if you take notice, have this marking of the black hand in their mouth, which is a symbol of organized crime, all right? Which is obviously a stereotype applied to many immigrant groups, most notably, I suppose, Italian Americans in the modern context often applied to Russian immigrants. In any case, you see it played out in this caricature. And you can see that the Pied Piper, he's leading these rats off to the United States. You see the Statue of Liberty on the left hand of the image. Here's another tremendous caricature, also tremendously insulting. There you see Uncle Sam, a worried Uncle Sam. He's clutching the American flag and he's embracing an image of the continental United States. And it says, "Danger to American ideas and institutions." And then if you look to the left, you'll see that in the waves, you have these immigrants floating in, and you have riffraff immigration written along the waves, right? So these are not folks that you want coming here because they're endangering our ideas. They're endangering our institutions. And what's really fascinating about this image, I think, is it's Trumpian before Trump, because there you see in the background this wall, this image of a wall suggesting that a wall will protect us. And obviously that's been so much a part of the national dialogue for the last 4, 8, even longer years. So the next image I want to talk about is this image about the Japanese, this anti-Japanese sign. This image is so powerful because it shows how immigrant communities, when they move into a new area, or immigrants, when they move into a new area, they get turned into these quality of life issues. I've often seen across the nation, and specifically in New Jersey where I live, this notion that immigrants, we don't really want them here. They're ruining our neighborhood. They're quality of life problems. It's also important too, because even though our focus today is on Latinos, there's probably no immigrant group that has been discriminated against more than Asian Americans. They're the ones to have suffered a complete exclusion from immigration in early laws in the late 19th and through a part of the 20th century. So, and obviously very timely given the anti-Asian attacks that have occurred in the aftermath or during the pandemic. So this would be a good time to move into a discussion of my second theme, and that is immigration from Latin America and the transformation from these national identities to the terms that are in common usage here, that is Latinos or Hispanics. So I want to go to another slide here. So let me skip a few. So obviously here is an anti-Latino sign. It's from the Southwest, early 20th century. I take a sort of silly pleasure in the fact that the person writing it doesn't have command of the English language, and you'll see that they use the possessive for whites and just instead of saying whites. But anyway, we serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexican. So here he's concerned about Spanish or Mexicans and doesn't know quite how to punctuate in English. Anyway, just a little point there. So in this next part of my presentation, I want to draw on the tremendous scholarship of Alejandro Portes and Ruben Rubat. And they really obliterate two basic stereotypes about Latino immigrants. One, they're not among the poorest of the poor in their nation because it takes money to travel to the United States. And they are better educated than most of the people in their countries of origin, right? So those are two of the stereotypes that they deal with. Now, I think it's so important that we take a look at the complicated nature of immigration in general, and certainly immigration from Latin America. There's nothing wrong with being a day laborer, but not every immigrant from a Spanish or Portuguese speaking nation in Latin America is a day laborer. And I think it's important to note that. And they point out in their work that there are four types of immigrants that they define. They define professional immigrants. These are folks who immigrate with nursing degrees, doctors, engineers, etc., whether from Latin America or other places of the world. Then there are refugees. And Juan Gonzalez has written a fantastic book, Harvest of Empire, which is a classic work on this subject, which talks about how US interference in Latin America has often led to an outflow of refugees. So my family, part of it are refugees from Cuba. And so this is another segment of our immigrant community. Then you have the entrepreneurial immigrants. When I was growing up in Hudson County in New Jersey, I'm thinking about Bergen Line Avenue. And I remember how the Cuban immigrants coming after the revolution really re-energized what was a moribund business district. And now, as the Cubans have moved away, Central Americans, folks from Colombia and other places have recreated that dynamic space again. All right, and then finally you have the labor immigrants. These are the ones you most likely see at muster zones gathering to be picked up. Now, Portes and Rumbat and I and others, we talk about this myth of illegality attached to many immigrants from our communities. And when I say it's a myth, there's some sort of impression that all of the immigrants in the past came here legally. And so I always, at this point, to my students, I say to them, does anyone know what WOP means? W-O-P, which is a slur often directed at Italians. And sometimes people get it, sometimes they don't. It means without papers, W-O-P, WOP. And so it's important to note again historically that until the early part of the 20th century, there were few immigration laws to break, except those prohibiting immigration from Asia. So after these laws in the 1920s were instituted, desperate European immigrants snuck in by the millions. A 1925 report indicated that there were 1.4 million immigrants living in the United States illegally. There are stories of immigrants passing some money to employees at Ellis Island to have them accept fraudulent documents, or the same documents being used by numerous immigrants to gain entry. So my point here is that this issue of desperate people seeking economic opportunity and breaking laws to get and stay here is not unique to this current day. It is part of our American history. So I want to show you a few other images from an exhibit I attended in 2015 by immigrant artists that show, some modern takes on immigration. So let me stop sharing this screen and hopefully I will be able to get to the next one. Let's see if okay, I think that's pretty clear, that one, right? So from that exhibit, this is definitely one of my favorite paintings. In the background you can see immigrants, and from their dress, it's obvious that they are from Mexico. And if you look down at the bottom of the painting, you'll see that there's a border there between the United States and Mexico. So the immigrants are standing in the United States just across the border from Mexico. I'm not quite sure of the symbolism here, but in front of them is a fair-haired woman waving an American flag. But my favorite part of the painting is in the forefront, there are these aliens standing in the area around Mexico. All right. Now, so obviously art is subjective matter, but I really love the way that this artist is playing with this concept of alien, suggesting that the aliens have come from or the immigrants have come from an alien location. So I'm sure you've heard this term, illegal alien, applied to immigrants across the United States. And it's such an off-putting language, right? When you call somebody illegal and an alien, what do you do with that kind of language, right? For me, this imagery, this painting suggests they are humans. They are not aliens. So anyway, I really like the imagery of this painting. And then finally, I have another slide, my last slide of the presentation. And so this last image seeks to humanize the aliens. It suggests that they are us. It places our face in the middle of the permanent alien resident card. So you can see that I'm taking a photo there of this image that you see here today from that exhibit. So to segue now to the final of my three themes, right? I wish to again bring up the work of Portes and Rumbat. They have done a series of longitudinal studies on a variety of immigrant groups from Latin America. And what they found is that different immigrant groups have taken more or less time to adjust to life in the United States. It suggests that some groups have been able to achieve significant educational and economic achievements quicker than other groups. Now, I bring this up as a warning against hubris, a warning against thinking that your countrymen and women are superior to others. Many times I have heard folks in our Latino communities puff up their chests and gloat over their accomplishments and diminish others from different parts of Latin America or different parts of the world. And my advice, as gray-haired old guy that I am, is we should refrain from doing this. It is one thing to be proud of our heritage. It is another thing to be arrogant about it. So the work of Portes and Rumbat indicates that the factors leading to immigration and the socioeconomic background of those immigrants will have a big impact on how long it takes for folks to adapt here to life in the United States. And these are factors as educated, thoughtful folks engaging in this immigration debate we need to have in the back of our mind. So I as a college professor, I could speak on these issues all day here, but I'm running out of time. I have the very talented Mark Hugo Lopez following up here. And so that kind of concludes my three overarching points. I'm sure I've missed some key issues, and perhaps in our discussion between the three of us that we can further expand on some points. So I look forward to hearing Mark's thoughtful commentary. And again, I thank Luis and Mark for being on the panel with me, and I thank the organizers for inviting me today. Thank you so much.
Profesor Argote, muchísimas gracias.
Professor Argote, thank you very much. Thank you, Frank. And I think this cartoons show everything. It's all this journey from a long time, what immigrants have gone through in this nation. And just recent reference when Univision brought me from Colombia as an executive producer in 1994. We had this scenario of the immigration reform of the Reagan administration, and we left this environment. But when I started working in Telemundo the following year, we started seeing this animosity against immigrants. And it's relevant to mention how in our non-island area, we've had from words and cartoons to facts. You may all remember the attack against two Leberman working class immigrants that were attacked by two white persons in a racist attack that generated some commotion because at a given moment the administration in the Suffolk County led by Steve Levy promoted these kind of actions against immigrants, and it was the epicenter of action. We never thought that what was happening in Long Island at that time we would have to live it for years and years for 4 years during the Reagan administration, and that happened at that level. So the interesting thing is all this environment that we've been through, and something interesting is that immigrants, as they are attacked, it's also a prize for their achievements. And well, great presentation, Professor Argot. Now Mike Lopez, because he has the current scenario. And I think we should start there because he has current figures of what's going on and the new environment that we're living. And perhaps, Mark, we could say that people feel at rest nowadays. I haven't seen that for years. The Fifth Avenue full of delivery people and the immigrants that went out to protest and ask for legislation. So that's part of this framework. What's the reality? What do figures say? Thank you, Luis. I'm going to speak in English because my presentation has lots of information, but also ideas that cover many aspects that are interesting and that are hard to explain. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to start.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to our conversation, Francis and Luis, particularly around everything around immigration. I want to talk to you about some of the work of the Pew Research Center, focused on the current wave of immigration to the United States, a wave that started in 1965 with the change in the nation's immigration laws and the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act then, which essentially established the current system of immigration that the United States has. I'm going to first, though, want to tell you a little bit about who we are at Pew Research, just to be clear about the center and how the center works. The Pew Research Center is based in Washington, D.C. We are what we call ourselves a fact tank. We're nonpartisan and non-advocacy. And that's important to keep in mind since we don't make any policy recommendations. Our purpose is only to provide information. And one of the key ways we do that is by looking at demographic data. And another very important way is by using public opinion data that we ourselves collect to document the attitudes and opinions of the nation and also the U.S. Latino population. And I'm going to share with you some findings on for both of those groups today. So first, some data. The nation's story about immigration is really one, as Frank said, of many waves. There's been more than one wave of immigration to the United States. Today, there's about 45 to 46 million people, and the estimates, and keep in mind that these are estimates, do vary, but it's about 45 to 46 million people living in the United States today who were born in another country. At the Pew Research Center, you'll notice that this chart shows you how this number compares to the past. So in the past, when the number of immigrants living in the US reached a peak last was in the 1920s, that peak was, of course, much smaller than today's number because the population of the United States then was much smaller. But we project that by 2065, 100 years after the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act, the population of immigrants living in the US is likely to reach about 78 million people. So keep that in mind. Again, it's a projection. A lot has changed, frankly, since we did this projection, and this would be a different number today. But even so, immigration has been an important story for the nation's demographics. Looked at another way, the share of the US population that is foreign-born reached a peak of almost 15% in the 1890 census, and also into the 1920s. As Frank was saying, the number had reached some new highs. Today, we're at about 14%. So we're approaching these record numbers in terms of the share of the US population that is foreign-born. I would add there's another component to this, which is not only the share of the population that is foreign-born, but also the share of the population that are US-born to at least one immigrant parent. That additional share is maybe about another 10 to 15%, so that you're looking at a nation that is about either 25 to 30% either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrant parents. So the immigrant connection is very close to many of the experiences of the nation's population today. It's a very different country today than just 20 years ago, in fact, because of the growing number of immigrants and the children born here to those immigrant parents. Immigration has been so important for the nation's population, this can't be understated. Without immigration, the US would have grown, but grown much more slowly. So to give you some sense of this, in the 50 years from 1965 to 2015, the nation's population grew from 193 million people to 324 million. 72 million of that difference by 2015 was due to immigrants and their offspring in the United States, so their descendants in the United States. If we had had no immigration, the US would have been at about 252 million people. That's a pretty big difference. And when we look forward, the impact is even greater. Immigrants and their descendants will continue to drive US population growth. By 2065, we estimate that the US will be about 440 million people. Without immigration, the US population would peak sometime in the 2030s, 2040s, and start to decline in size, being about 338 million by 2065. So when you take a look at the role of immigration, it's been important for the past and the demographics of the country, and it's important for the future of the country as well. I want a little side note here. This is one of the ways in which the US is distinguished from other high-income countries, in that our demographics are somewhat better than others, though our demographics too are changing and the nation is aging, the nation is having fewer children. But demographically speaking, the US is in a better position than, say, a Germany or a Japan or a China or a Russia because of immigration. Now, speaking of those waves of immigration, when you take a look at those waves, there are three distinctive waves. There was the first Northern European wave in the mid-19th century. There was a Southern and Eastern European wave in the late 19th, early 20th, and then there's the modern wave. And I've put this together to show you where people are from. What are the origins of migrants in each of these waves? I think the most important thing to note here is how distinctive this most recent wave is. About half of all immigrants in this current wave of 59 million people have come from Latin America, mostly from Mexico, but from Latin America, generally speaking. A quarter are from Asia, and that too is a change from the past. But as you can see, the waves previously that had come to the US were largely European, although there was a presence, of course, of Latin American and Asian immigrants as well in those previous waves. You can see this in another way, and I want to show you some maps. This is the US in 1960, in each state, the largest immigrant group. So, for example, in Illinois, the largest immigrant group were Poles, or people from Poland, in 1960. In California, people from Mexico. In Florida, people from the United Kingdom or British. And you can see Italians in the Northeast. A very European map when you take a look at 1960. And keep in mind, this is right before the change in the law of 1965, which changed the way in which immigration happens in the United States. Now, this is data from 2013, but frankly, things haven't changed. As you can see, Mexicans are the largest immigrant group in about 35 states, 33 states. And there is a much more diverse population of immigrants from places other than Europe in the mix of largest immigrant groups state by state. So for example, in Hawaii, the largest immigrant group are people who are born in the Philippines. In Florida, it's people born in Cuba. In the mid-Atlantic, it is El Salvador. In New York State, it is the Dominican Republic. But as you can see, there is a very different combination of immigrants today, state by state, than there was in the past. And Mexicans are the dominant group. In fact, it is the single largest immigrant group in the United States today. So all that immigration, all that population growth, let's put some numbers to it, at least recent numbers. So between 2010 and 2019, the nation's Hispanic population grew by almost 10 million people. And the Hispanic population growth alone has accounted for half of the nation's population growth since 2010. Let me say that again. Half of the nation's population growth has come from Hispanic population growth. Most of that is births to Hispanic parents, but it also includes the arrival of some new immigrants. But you can see how important Hispanic population growth is for the nation. By contrast, the nation's white population actually was unchanged, declined slightly. We're waiting for final census numbers to find out what the actual count is. But as you can see, the Hispanic population has been important for the nation's population growth. In terms of the largest immigrant groups, you can see that Mexicans are the largest immigrant group in the United States among those 45 million. About 11.2 million people living in the country today were born in Mexico. I should say this number is declining. It reached a peak of about 12.2 million, 12.5 million in 2007, but since has been coming down as Mexicans are more likely to return now than arrive in the US, although those things could be changing. But Mexicans alone make up a quarter of the nation's immigrant population. The other large groups in order are Chinese, Indian, Filipino, and Salvadoran. If I were to continue to go to the next 5 to have the top 10, you would also hear countries like Guatemala, Honduras. You would hear countries like the Dominican Republic and Cuba in the top 10. So that 5 of the top 10 largest immigrant groups in the country are Latin American immigrant groups. So it's important, again, to keep in mind how big a deal Latin American immigration has been for the US immigration story. Now, the other big story here is, as I hinted at a little earlier, that immigration from Mexico has been declining. And that's been true for a while now. It started in 2006, even before the Great Recession. But as a result, among new arrivals, Asians now outnumber people from Latin America. And this has been the case for for more than a decade now. And this really is a major change. After 40 plus years of Latin America dominating the numbers of new arrivals, it is now Asia that dominates this number. There are more Chinese, more Indian new arrivals in any given year than from Mexico. And it's not that India and China are surging, they're rising. But it's really that Mexico was so high and has come down after many years of being over 500,000 plus new arrivals from the 1990s into the early 2000s. This is, I think, important to note because, again, these are changing flows, these are changing stories and changing details. Let me talk a little bit about some immigration trends, just to get some facts on the table. First, among those 45 million immigrants, 3/4 are in the US legally. I think we miss that a lot. We miss the conversation about the status, the legal status of immigrants in the United States. Most are here legally. Half are US citizens. They've chosen to become naturalized US citizens. Now, this is all immigrants. On that naturalized citizen story, it is also important to note that that lawful permanent residence number of 12.3 million includes a lot of Mexicans, about maybe 3.5 million people who are in the United States legally, but have not become US citizens yet. Only about 40% of Mexican legal permanent residents ultimately become a US citizen. It's actually one of the lowest shares. And so it's a big population of many people who are here legally, but just haven't made that step to become a naturalized US citizen. And I think that's another important point. It can be expensive, it can be time consuming. And also, maybe not everybody wants to become a US citizen, I think is another important part of the story here to keep in mind. There are also about 10.5 million what at the center we identify as unauthorized immigrants. These are los indocumentados, these are undocumented immigrants. Some people might call them illegal immigrants. We use unauthorized because they're not authorized to be in the country. That captures not only people who might enter the country by crossing the US-Mexico border without authorization, but also people who overstay a visa. And here too, I think it's important to note that this population, even though there's 10.5 million unauthorized immigrants in the US today that we estimate, this population is changing as the composition becomes more about people who are, a growing share I should say, are people who overstay visas, like people from India. It's actually, India has one of the fastest growing groups of undocumented immigrants, people who come here to the US to study or work and then overstay their visa and then they become unauthorized. As opposed to people crossing the US-Mexico southern border and entering the country in an undocumented way and therefore are unauthorized. That still happens, of course, and I'm going to get to that in the next slide. But it's important to note that this story is one of change. And Mexico, of course, is declining. The number of Mexican undocumented immigrants has fallen by about 2 million people since the Great Recession. At the border, if you're following the news, this is probably what you've been hearing a lot about. Unaccompanied minors and families presenting themselves at the US-Mexico border, apprehended by the Border Patrol, and seeking asylum. This is been a big part of the story of who's been apprehended at the US-Mexico border in recent years. And these numbers, by the way, are numbers of apprehension events. It is not the number of people. Some of these are people who have been apprehended more than once because they get apprehended by the Border Patrol, are sent back to Mexico, and then they try again and they get apprehended a second time or a third time. This is not individuals. This is the number of apprehension events that have happened. But there's been a change. In 2019, it was largely families and unaccompanied minors. And earlier on during the Obama years, it was a lot of unaccompanied minors, a lot of kids coming across the border seeking protection and also seeking to find family members in the US. But more recently, it is single adults who make up the larger share of the apprehension story at the border in the last few months. This is an important change because this is exactly what it used to be like in the past. In the 90s and 2000s, many of those apprehended at the border were single adults, oftentimes single men, like 16 to say 25. And so there has been a change here, and COVID might have something to do with this as economies throughout the Americas have struggled to recover from the COVID-19 economic impact. Even so, these numbers, while looking impressive, are way below where we were in the 1990s and early 2000s, when you might have apprehensions of almost 1 million people in some years, or apprehension events in some years in the past. So while these numbers are rising and rising quickly, this is not necessarily at the same level that we were in the past. So there has been some conversation that we're getting close to those levels. And I think in terms of that legal immigration, about 1 million people, did you know, are admitted to the United States in any given year? Think about that, 1 million people legally admitted to the United States. Most come in through family-sponsored visas, and that is where some conversation in Congress has focused, is on family-sponsored immigration. Maybe that should be reined in some. We'll see what happens in terms of legal immigration, but the Trump administration had been talking about changes to the legal immigration programs of the United States. Now, all of this has implications for the group that we're here to talk about, which is Latinos in the United States. Did you know that about 31% of the nation's Hispanic population are immigrants? But that number is down from 40% in 2000. So the share of the US Hispanic population that is foreign-born or was born in another country has been declining. That number varies, though, widely depending on the origin group. Among, say, for example, if you're talking about Venezuelans, you'll find that more than 70% were born in Venezuela. So that's different from, say, the story for Mexicans, where maybe about 30% were born in Mexico. So these populations by origin groups in the United States do vary tremendously in terms of their US-born and foreign-born shares, and they represent different stories. And it's important to keep that disaggregation in mind because the nation's Hispanic population itself is very, very diverse. So what does this mean for identity? Well, the ways in which Latinos identify with their home country or the country of their ancestors does vary by immigrant generation. Immigrants, of course, strongly identify with their country of heritage. They'll when you ask them about their background, they'll say, "Oh, I'm from Honduras," and that will be their first and most often way in which they identify. Among those born in the United States, the second generation to immigrant parents, the story is somewhat more mixed. 39% use their country of heritage or their families first. 39% use Hispanic or Latino, and 22% say they're American. By the third generation, it really truly is divided. A third, a third, a third by each one of these groups in terms of how people identify themselves. This story of identity changing across the immigrant generations is going to become a bigger part of the US Hispanic story as the population becomes more settled and immigration from Latin America remains below its peaks of the 90s. And when it comes to the things that matter most to how Latinos identify themselves, here too, it really varies across immigrant generations. Speaking Spanish is oftentimes seen as the most important way for somebody to say, when you ask, what does being Hispanic mean to you? Spanish is oftentimes identified as one of the most important things that you could do to really express your Hispanic identity. But as you can see, there are many other things here that are of relatively less importance, like, for example, being Catholic. Only 16% of all Latinos say that that's an essential part of what being Hispanic means to them. But you also see a difference across the generations. No matter the measure, these markers of identity are less likely to be cited by third and higher generation Hispanics, the group, by the way, that is soon to be the fastest growing group in the population of Hispanics. And then when we talk about identity, looking even farther forward, did you know, by the way, that about 1/4 of all Hispanic newlyweds marry somebody who's not Hispanic, which means that in future generations, you're going to have an identity of young people who may not identify as Hispanic. And this is from 2 surveys that we did, looking at the share of people with Hispanic ancestry who actually self-identify as part of the Hispanic population. And you can see that if you're an immigrant or you're the children of immigrants, 90% plus will say, yeah, I'm Hispanic and I have Hispanic ancestry. But by the 4th or higher generation, only half do so. So as we look to the future, what will be the future for the Hispanic population in the US? I don't know, but I think we might have more people who say they have a Hispanic great-grandmother, like a Mexican great-grandmother, but they themselves don't identify as Hispanic. We'll see where things go. Many things can happen, but this is one of the things that we're tracking at the center. Finally, some public opinion data on immigration. And first, when you take a look at the ways in which Americans see immigrants, there's been a reversal in their views of the roles of immigrants and the value of immigrants for the country. In the 90s, the 2/3 of Americans said that immigrants were a burden on the country because they take jobs, housing, and healthcare. But by 2019, those numbers had flipped. 2/3 instead today say that immigrants strengthen our country through hard work and talent. Now, that was admittedly before COVID-19. I don't think this has changed, but you should know that Democrats particularly are the ones driving this number, but Republicans at least have been flat in the share that say immigrants strengthen the country, but there is a partisan divide. What about the priorities what are the public's priorities for immigration policy? Here is a survey that we just did in April, and you can see that for the US public overall, it is increasing staffing and resources available to patrol and police the border. That is the goal that is sort of seen as most important for US immigration policy. Also increasing staff and resources to process unaccompanied minors and reducing the number of people seeking asylum. Those are the top 3 goals here among the US public. But you can also see that providing more assistance to countries in places like Central America is also one of these priorities that, while it's towards the bottom of this list of things that we asked about half of Americans say that's an important goal for US immigration policy. Also, when it comes to the job that the US government is doing at the US-Mexico border, Americans are somewhat less likely to say today that it's doing a good job. In fact, during the Trump years, it was slightly higher. 33% of Americans in 2019 said the US government then was doing a very good or somewhat good job of dealing with the number of people crossing the US-Mexico border seeking asylum. Today, 29% say that. But note the change in views among Republicans and Democrats. Republicans have dropped from 55 to 13% over this period, while Democrats have gone from 15% saying it was a good job during the Trump years to 42% now saying that during the Biden years. And when it comes to undocumented immigrants, you should know that about half of Republicans say there should not be a path for undocumented immigrants to stay in the US. This is a number that's been rising steadily over the course of many years, but the general US public is of the view that undocumented immigrants should be allowed to stay in the US if they meet certain requirements. This is also something we've been tracking for a long time and hasn't changed much. And when it comes to immigration as a priority, you'll see that 39% of Americans say that in 2021, dealing with immigration should be a top priority for the president and Congress to address this year. This is from a survey done at the beginning of this year. But as you can see, the economy, coronavirus outbreak were at the top of the list of issues that Americans cited back then. I'm going to stop there. I look forward to our conversation, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share all this with you. And I'm happy to also share my slides if folks are interested. Thank you.
I would like to give the floor to Mark and I would like to thank Mark for his wonderful presentation. And I have an additional question. 63% of Americans have a positive perception with regards to immigrants' contributions. Perhaps we could think that a similar number consider this is the proper time for immigration reform and that we can respond to these contributions of immigrants. Well, I don't know. Perhaps Americans may want to change the immigration law, but it depends on the party of that group because Republicans say they want support to change the immigration laws in order to help undocumented immigrants. They want the security of the border. And in total, people from the United States, Americans, and the youth want immigration law, let's say, more relaxed in order to help immigrants have an immigration flow or a way for them to enter the United States this year because they consider immigrants are important for the demographics of the United States and the economy and life in the United States. So I think that opinions of the Americans are changing, but it depends on the party they belong to. That's a good point. At least there is a change in attitude that it's fundamental, and this subject it's for both of you, whoever wants to answer. And we're living an interesting time, new administration after 4 years of anti-immigration policies. President Biden, from his famous debate when he announced immigration reform for the 11 million undocumented people, he took office, he started proposing it, and now we have this problem in the border. mm, Children with their families and thousands of families that are there, the borderline, they were sent to Mexico intense. So, but we've seen the past 2 weeks that in average, they are reporting 200, 250 families that are crossing the border, that are meeting their family, and that figure of 3,700 children, 600 out of 9,000 has reduced to 3,000. How can this change? And when Professor Argote mentioned how immigration is related to socio-political issues and the Central American Triangle and why people do have to come here and the intent of Biden's administration to go beyond and help countries in order to try to stop this immigrant flow. So what can we expect out of this scenario when everyone is talking about this immigration reform? The floor is open. Well, I'm not too optimistic with regard to this immigration reform. I don't see there are enough votes at the Senate to pass the law. Uh, Perhaps I got a little bit more faith with the dreamers, the finding a way to for them to get their citizenship. And I remember that some years ago, there were 55 votes for dreamers. I don't remember the year. And if not by the filibuster, that bill would have been approved. So I think perhaps there is an opportunity with this new administration to but the immigration reform, which is comprehensive, I really doubt it. I don't know what you think, Luis, since you're discussing this on a daily basis. And Mark, sorry, Mark, in order to complement what the professor mentioned, and that's quite interesting. For those of you to know, the filibuster is that we require 60 votes in the Senate so that opposition has some guarantees, and in this case with the immigration reform. But as it happened with the last package of economic aid, and that's reviewed by senators and Congress, women working there, it seems like the Democrats' strategy is working on conciliation. It's trying to approve a law with simple majority, and that's what they have in the Senate. And it seems like the strategy, and here Mark may have recommended strategies not to perform to present this as a block because it would imply the filibuster and the Republican support, but present this in fragments. First, which is the project they are discussing, Senator Padilla and this legal committee is there for the dreamers, first for dreamers, agricultural workers, and essential workers. And they would acknowledge what Mark mentioned as part of the historical background. And with that, 5 million people would benefit, and they could link this initiative to the economic subject, which is the priority for Americans at this moment. And they would present this reform gradually. And in the end, the goal it's reach, which is bringing to legality a number of immigrants. I think that's the landscape of what's being discussed, and I think that's the Democrats' strategy. Yes, there is support by the American population for these sections of migration reform. So this is for documented for dreamers, and also to help countries of Central America, and also to offer more aid to children at the borderline. So I think there is more appetite for this small sections of immigration reform in, within the American population as part of the service. But also, uh, in order to have a whole change and a comprehensive immigration reform for the United States, it's that's complicated because it's big and it was hard in the past with other administrations. And I think it's the same situation now. But within the Americans, opinions are drifting, are changing. Now Americans want to help dreamers, want to help legal immigrants or legal aliens. They want to help countries in Central America. So opinions are changing, not only within Democrats, but in Americans in general, particularly for the youth. The youth, even Republicans want to change an immigration law, just like Democrats in as a whole. So I think that's the future, and I think it's quite interesting. Some consider, and that's a comment I have for you to express your opinion. Some people consider that this scenario of immigration reform, even in sections, it's like a perfect storm because the fiscal deficit increases on a daily basis. Pandemics got in the midst of it, and it has led us to deficit and debt, which is enormous. So the immigration reform in 1986 happened because there was a huge debt growing with the payment that we had at that moment, and immigrants came to cover that fiscal deficit and contribute even more than they've done before now in pandemics. Now with this deficit growing, some figures mentioned in the legal committee of the Senate, they are discussing $1.4 billion that would enter only with that project of 5 million people being legalized via that project. So are we really in a time in which the deficit and the economic situation and the outcomes of the pandemic could help and justify the consolidation of this project? I think point of This scenario, it's the unemployment rate in the United States, because the unemployment rate in the United States, it's a little bit high if compared to 2019, and there is a historic background. Many of the companies do not have the workers they require. Uh, Immigration may help the American economy. So with these 5 million people that are here but are undocumented, and that may mm, benefit from a change in immigration law. I That's one part, but there is another one. As an economist, I am an economist. The labor market may require more persons, more workers, and immigrants from the Americas and from other parts of the world may help our economy with a change in the system. It's feasible that we could have a new immigration flow, but legal immigration and part of the system of immigration of the United States. And I think that there are other parts. There are different parts in this history, and it's interesting because I think the administration is talking about some other parts of this change for those who are here, but also a change in immigration law to help companies here and open the possibility for other people in the world who want to come to the United States to live and make part of our country. And Professor Gotte, historically and socially, we need this direct aid to Central American countries in order to consolidate the process of immigration law, even though it's fragmented. Well, absolutely. We need to help these countries, because if we do not help them to increase their level, the thing is that they will have to come here. And I wanted to talk about some of the things you've mentioned, Luis. I always tell people I used to be thin. My hair was black when I started this struggle, this fight for a solution to comprehensive immigration. And your argument, it's quite reasonable. Your economic argument, it's reasonable, but I think I conceive this subject. It's a strong political weapon for those who love using immigrants as uh, political football. Um, Even though what you say it's logical, I think there are many reasons for it not to succeed. I do see some possibilities for dreamers. They are looking for a way to get their citizenship. If there is some support from country, and as they say, politics. La política es el arte de lo posible. Politics is the art of possible, and I think that is possible now. I think for dreamers that's possible. Hopefully, I wish I was wrong here, but that's my position. That's what I think. Now, in order to finish this argument about Central America, this has to be. We have to do something. It's not because we are good people and we are so decent that we want to help them. That actually helps ourselves, because if we help them, they can stay in their own countries and they can actually buy our products. If we leave them in poverty, they won't benefit anyone, none themselves, none ourselves. So they are our neighbors, and we need to try to improve their uh, ways of living, as we did with Europe after World War II. It was a huge contribution from ourselves, but that actually benefited us. If we conceive this i- a largo plazo, in the long term, that will benefit us. But convincing people about this, it's hard. even though Mark gave me some optimistic perspective when I saw his figures.
Sí, sí, sí. Ahora, profesor,
Yes, and Professor, we are
de un plan
at the
Marshall
right
para
time
Latinoamérica,
for
usted
a
menciona
Marshall
lo que pasó después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial,
plan for Latin
un
America.
golpe de
At
vaina
this moment, we don't have a war,
social,
but we have a
una
social
crisis social.
catastrophe, a
¿Cree
social
que es tiempo
crisis.
Centroamérica
Is it
para
time
retomar
for a
ese
Marshall
proceso?
Plan for Central America? Yes, it's necessary. 20 years ago, we should have done it. And it's important because we won't solve this issue of immigration if we do not have this sort of programs. We may say whatever we want, but without that, we won't solve that issue.
Mientras se resuelve la situación, Mark,
Well, we solve this
se
issue, Mark. I
hablaba
have a key
de
question.
11 millones de
We're talking about
indocumentados
11 millions undocumented because
dice
this
que
figures
inicialmente
was
era
up
10.4.
to it was 10.4, but some consider that during the Trump administration that number was reduced. Number of people who decided to return to their countries of origin. But what's the number? You have the figures and you have all this clear. Well, we will have a new number in the next few months. I don't know exactly, but I do think there is not a huge change because some other groups indicate that it's almost 11 million. According to the Immigration Policy Institute of the United States government, it would be 10.4 million. And there are some other ideas, but I do think that it's possible to increase this because with the economy of the United States in 2019, the economy had good numbers and we had a growth in immigrants that wanted to come to the United States or want to go to the United States. And I think it's possible to have growth in that number, but I don't know exactly and it's if it will be significant or not. I will bring two subjects. We're about to finish, but I want to seize the opportunity. We have two wonderful experts. Some people say President Biden, even though he said he's ready for re-election, but from a pragmatical perspective, a realistic perspective, President knows he is in a historical opportunity to do things for our country, and due to circumstances we're living, so that generates some hope for many to be optimistic about this. And Democrats are also aware that they don't know if 1 year or 2 years they will have this majority, and they want to um, move forward with this immigration reform, and that's there are some others who want to stop this dream of for dreamers. Well, going back to reconciliation, I think the parliamentary issue on putting all this on the table or on a law, it happened with the COVID package. And I really doubt. Well, the reconciliation process is for economic matters, and I think I see this argument you've given us about why this is an economic thing, but I think that this is so diverse that perhaps the Senate won't live of this as part of a law. So I am really concerned that even though this is a plan and this is a strategy from Biden and the Democrats, it won't be possible in the end. I think if it is more modest, for instance, just for the dreamers, it may happen. That's my opinion. And I wanted to be more optimistic, but that's my analysis.
Mark,
Well, I really don't know. I don't really have a perspective, but it's possible that we in elections, immigration will be a strong subject, but it depends on the economy, the pandemic, the situation in the world, and what we can do or what the administration can do with this environment, because there are many, not problems, but situations in this country that are negative. So I think that Joe Biden has a lot on his table and his administration, but we'll see. In a year, I would like to have another meeting. We can buy some beers. And I wish you prove me wrong. Mezcal, please. Yes, in order to be consonant with immigration subject. Another interesting thing, in the past 20 years, we've seen that the immigration subject, it's getting complicated because governments have had to issue executive numbers. It's a case of Obama with political needs to move this forward in the Congress, then President Trump with executive orders. Everyone has said for the past 20 years the Congress needs to react. The Congress has the responsibility in immigration matters. What do you think about this? Do we have a Congress that will assume the responsibility and assume this situation on immigration? No, I don't know, but it's interesting that for 20 years there hasn't been any change in immigration law, and for Americans, immigration it's not that important. Immigration, it's not in the top of the priorities for public policies, such as it happened with Iraq and the economy, recession, pandemic, and some other subjects. Immigration, it's like number 3, 4, or 20 in a list of public policies for all these years. And I don't know if we will have a change. It's interesting though. And I think there is another interesting thing. In 2019, during the 2019 immigration was number 2 priority for the American population in the case of public policies. And because I think Donald Trump talked a lot about immigration and the problem with the border and with the new flow of immigrants from Central America. But I think that now with the pandemic and the economy and unemployment and the world, there is a lot more discussion among Americans about some other matters. We just have 2 minutes left. But if we have a lesson from the Trump administration, is what you mentioned in your arguments, it's that immigration remains a political tool and a demagogical tool when it is required for good or worse, for better or worse. Now, your conclusions, 30 seconds. What can we expect after all that's being said? I understand your position, which is, I don't wouldn't say it's pessimistic. I think you're pragmatic and anything may happen. But let's close this with your opinions on what's coming in terms of immigration. I see there is an open door for dreamers. I think there is a lot of sympathy towards them. Um, they they've been a political force which is powerful, and I think there is an opportunity for them. I really doubt there will be a comprehensive immigration plan. I don't think I I don't have a crystal ball. Yeah, that crystal ball. When I look at my crystal ball, I don't see that. So that's what I can say. That's what I think. I think Biden, it's more open or aware before the situation than Obama, but he doesn't have the support of the Congress. Mark, what do you think? Immigration, it's important for the United States demography, and it won't change because now we have many immigrants, 45 million people, 45 million immigrants, and the children of immigrants are going to be the most important source for this population in the United States. Now, in terms of the opinion of Americans towards immigrants, I think it's interesting that immigrants are important for the country. That's what they think. And in the mind of the Americans is changing towards diversity. They consider diversity as something important for the diversity of our country. And I think this conversation, this talk on immigrants, it's changing and will keep changing. Specifically, it would be positive for immigration. And I also wanted to highlight that uh, immigrants are important for their opportunities for the children of the future of their families. So I think that's interesting that immigrants say the American dream it's part of their lives. And that's something important because that it's a reflection of the life this country, and they are part of the life of this country. Mark and Professor Agota, thank you very much. I think this has been a fruitful debate. We've been able to analyze the historical perspective, but also the current scenario of what's happening with immigrants, their history and their contributions. Thanks a lot for taking part in this forum. Pleasure. It's a pleasure sharing the panel with you. Thank you very much. And as a conclusion, the legacy of immigrants nowadays, it's more important than ever. That is acknowledged by the Americans with this change in attitude and image. We notice there is an attitude of acknowledging there is some contribution. I think we've gone through hard times and nightmares for many families just for the fact of being undocumented. But I think I do believe in the legacy and what it means. And I think, Eliana, that's the way in which we've been able to participate and contribute in this forum. I would like to thank Eliana, Gustavo, Ayako. And as we all say, hopefully, this dream may come true for so many people in this nation.
Agradecemos mucho su
We
participación.
appreciate your participation. Please do not forget to fill in the surveys. Remember that your response is absolutely private, confidential, and we will not compile any personal information. Your suggestions and comments will help us improve for future editions of our event. Thank you very much.